Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Bud Riss. I'm a board member of Boston Harbor Now. I chair the Policy and Planning Committee of the board, and I, at my custom, I have been many times now the host of these Boston Harbor forums that we hold often on a monthly basis, sometimes a little bit less frequently, particularly as we wound our way through the COVID crisis. I hope everybody with us recovered from the debate last night, those who saw it. I promise you we'll do a much better job both in moderating and having a really good, productive discussion here this morning. We're very happy to have Charlie Jewell from the Boston Water and Sewer Commission. He's going to bring us up to date on the work that the commission is doing, both around freshwater inundation flooding and also saltwater flooding. If this is your first time joining the Harbor Use Public Forum, or if you're not familiar with us, Boston Harbor Now is an organization that is very committed to making sure the harbor is accessible to and works for everyone. We work on a range of issues, from expanding ferry service to bringing underserved communities out to experience the harbor islands, to providing innovation in our working port, to advocating on harbor development projects. Several members of the Boston Harbor Now staff are with us this morning. You've seen Alice, who will take over from me as our moderator in just a moment. We also have Kathy Abbott, who is the president and CEO of Boston Harbor Now, and Aaron Toffler, who is the director of policy. We had signups of way more than 100 people. I think we just crossed 101 as I'm speaking. So one of the great benefits of Zoom is we can have a much bigger room and have many more people join us, which is great. Boston Harbor Now convenes these forums monthly to hear from developers, public agencies, and other advocates about work taking place around the waterfront. Sometimes it's planning initiatives, sometimes it's specific development projects. And this morning, we're very happy to have Charlie here from the Boston Water and Sewer Commission. I've been tracking this project with great interest. I've been involved in the Climate Ready Boston work now for 6 or 7 years. We focused a lot on how to keep the salt water out of the city. Charlie has 2 tasks there. Not only does he have to keep the salt water out of his facilities, but he's got to make sure the fresh water flows the other direction. So it'll be really important to hear from him this morning. John Sullivan from the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, I think, is also on the phone, and I'm sure he'll correct any mistakes Charlie makes, which will be very few. So, so we're excited to have everybody today. I'm going to turn it back to Alice, and she'll take over from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Bud. If you're arriving late, I want to remind you that you can always use the chat function to introduce yourself and share your reactions throughout. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. It's next to the chat button. That will allow us to sort of feed through them. And if there's anything that's super pressing, like it's on a slide and you're like, what does that mean on that slide, Charlie? Feel free to ask that question then. If it's something I know isn't going to be addressed in a future slide, because I've gotten to see a preview, I'll ask him, I'll just pop in and ask your question as he's going. Charlie says, please interrupt, please ask questions. So feel free to use the Q&A function. It'll be easier for me to monitor and make sure we don't miss anyone's question. And with that, I'd like to introduce Charlie Jewell, the Director of Planning and Sustainability at the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, to talk about how BWSC is preparing for many different kinds of storms and flood events. Today's storm tells us that there are lots of different kinds of storm and flood events, and what Boston Water and Sewer Commission wants the public and other public agencies to know about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Bud and Alice. I appreciate that. A couple things. Yes, before we got on, Bud and Alice and I were talking about the debate last night. We got ourselves all worked up, so that was fun. A couple things. As you'll notice, I'm looking off to the side. Where I am is in our engineering video conference room. This is a room we developed to work in emergencies and stuff like that. But what I'm looking at is a very large monitor in front of me, and the camera is off to the side. So when I was first doing this, Alice was like, why aren't you looking at this thing? I'm like, well, the camera's over here. So just kind of bear that in mind. The camera's over here, but I'm looking at the monitor. A couple things I did ask Alice. Those of you that have been in presentations with me before know that sometimes I can talk fast. I'm going to do my best to slow down. I have told Alice, if I get speaking fast, slow me down. Also, as she said, if there are questions during this presentation, please ask them. We can stop and go back. I want to make sure that if there's something I'm missing or something you have a question about, please ask it. So what I want to start off with is for those of you that are not familiar with the commission, just to give you a quick background on some of the stuff that we have. Now, the commission is responsible for the sewer, drain, water system in the city of Boston. For this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the sewer and drain system. We have over 1,500 miles of sewers and drains. The sewers can range in size from 8 inches to 108. The drains from 12 to 240 to 186. We have 9 pump stations, 583 outfalls. Now, this is total outfalls. These are not just the commissions, and we're going to talk about that later, why that's important. We have 201 tide gates and over 50,000 manholes. What I want to start off with is some of the work the commission's been working on for a bit and kind of give some background. One of the things we started with early on was looking at our outfalls. And why this is important is we've been looking at sea level rise. And what we want to look at is as the sea level is rising, we want to make sure that our pipes do not act as a conduit to inundate inland areas. Where this could become important is if you have the land that's blocking the water from coming overland, but the land goes back down, the water could start causing inundation inland. So we were looking at this, and what we would do is we would kind of raise the sea level and see where we could see some inland inundation. We identified those areas, and then we said, okay, we need to get some tide gates in here where they were missing. This gives you an idea what I'm talking about. So we could have an area where it has some blockages, but the inland area goes down. So we need a tide gate to make sure that our pipes don't act as a conduit back behind the system. And this is what I'm talking about, is things that block the water from going in. We identified 5 areas during this project where we need to install tide gates, and those are going in now. And this is a picture of one going in the Seaport District. Now, I've talked about the total outfalls and all that stuff. What's important here is the commission is looking at its outfalls, but there are a lot of outfalls from other agencies and private sector. We can block our tide gates, but if the other agencies and the private sector are not doing this with their tide gates, we could still have problems inland. So we need to come up with a process for everyone to look at their system, install a tide gate if it's needed, and to make sure that it's properly inspected and maintained so it's active when we need it to be active. Now, as Bud was talking about, we're not only looking at ocean, but we're looking at freshwater as well. We know that the storms are going to be changing in our area. They're going to get more intense. They're going to get bigger. Now, the system that we have developed is what we have. Now, the commission has a major program to conduct a CMON program, and that's a capacity management, operation, and maintenance. And we're doing a major program to look at our pipes, inspect them, make sure they're clean, make sure they work to their maximum capacity when these things are needed during major events. But as the storms are changing, we have to worry about, can these pipes keep up with the new rain events? So what we decided to do is to look at areas upstream, up in the city. Are there areas that we could strategically store stormwater during major events to take the pressure off the system? So what we first did is we looked around and we identified 45 first potential sites. Then what we did is said, okay, which ones really have major potential? And we took it down to 20. What we then did is say, okay, some of these could be pretty similar. So if we looked at them, if a design could work at one, it could probably work at another one. So we then took it down to 10 sites that we really decided to dig into and develop conceptual designs of what would it take to take these locations, store stormwater, retain it, and then as the storm passes, when do we start releasing it and let the water go out? But take the pressure off the system. We're in the process now of finalizing the conceptual designs now. And then we're going to start looking at what's the next step to make these go forward. Now, the commission's been looking at the inundation process for a while. In 2015, the commission completed its wastewater facilities plan. Now, this is a 20-year master plan looking at our sewer and drain system and coming up with what do we need to do with our system long term. In there, we looked at climate change. So we looked at a 10-year design storm. We looked at the storms that are changing. We looked at inundation with the information that was out there. And what we developed was a model where we could look at the system and the impact on the commission in the city. Now, this model was a bathtub model. And what that essentially is you just take the water and you pour it on the system and you see where the water pools. One of the things we kind of noticed as we were looking at this was we were seeing inundation in areas that we didn't expect to. And so we thought this was kind of a very conservative approach, but we took that in consideration. Now, the other thing we did is we developed these heat maps, which people are used to. Now, this is one near the Long Wharf area. And this is an area to kind of show people, okay, this is the inundation that we're thinking is going to happen. What we then started doing was taking this out and showing it to people and say, okay, what does this say to you? And a lot of people were like, well, that's nice colors. Okay, there's going to be water there. But it didn't really convey properly what we wanted it to. Is how much water are we talking about? That also took into consideration we're going to talk about later. Now, Boston, Climate Ready Boston also has these tools on their website. So if you go to Climate Ready Boston, you'll see these inundation models and you can get it different information, and it shows where the inundation is expected. And you can play with different tides and different return frequency. But it's also showing these heat maps of where do we think the flooding's going to be. Now, during this time, Hurricane Harvey hit Houston. And it was a major event, as we all remember. Now, the Mayor Walsh, asked a question. The question was, what would happen if a major event like that were to hit Boston? What he was majorly concerned about is we need to have something where we would know where it's going to flood, how long it was going to flood, how deep the water was going to be, where do we need to get people from, where do we need, can we get them to, our critical functions located in these inundation zones. What do we need to do to get ready if a major event, like what happened in Houston, were to happen in Boston? So these are the parameters that we laid out of what we needed to do. So we decided to go back and look at our model and upgrade it. Now, the other thing that we did is we had Ellen Douglas over at UMass Boston work with us on this. She peer reviewed the work that we did because we wanted to make sure that we were developing this, but it was also being looked at so that people could say, okay, we agree with what they did, they looked at it, it's been reviewed, and she helped us along with this to make sure everything was followed and looked at. She gave her comments on this stuff. It was very helpful. So
Charlie?
what we did,
Charlie,
Alice,
yes, you're doing a lot of moving, like you're
Sorry.
talking on a stage, and some people are saying they can't hear you.
Sorry, I will stop that. Thank you. Did anyone miss anything important?
We have a couple questions if you want to pause
Sure.
and go back to a couple things.
Sure.
One question was, you said there were 10 retention sites.
Yes. So there are 10 sites that we thought that could have major significant benefit by retaining stormwater to take the pressure off the system. So we're taking those 10 sites and developing conceptual designs of what modifications need to be made at those sites to retain stormwater. How much could we retain on that site? Possibly could we also include features, because the commission's also dealing with phosphorus and we're trying to address the phosphorus system in the Charles River. So we have major green infrastructure programs to address the phosphorus, but we wanted to look at these and say, okay, could we use these large sites to not only retain stormwater, but to treat phosphorus at the same time? So we're looking at all that in here is how much water can we retain, what would it take to do it, are there major modifications that need to be made or not, what needs to be done, and then could it be used to treat phosphorus. How was that, Alice?
That's great. Is there a list of those sites that people can find out about where they are?
We will get that out. Yeah, we'll get that out.
Okay. Multiple questions have come in on the retention site.
Okay. Okay.
The other question, someone missed the name of that peer-reviewed agency that looked at the inundation study.
It was Ellen Douglas over at UMass Boston. Ellen is a major person with climate change. UMass Boston is doing a lot of work with climate change. She's a professor over at UMass Boston.
Great. Wow, we got a lot of questions just popping in now that we've paused. What percentage of 2-hour rainwater do you plan to retain?
Each site is different. It depends on what the capability of the site and what we're able to do at the site. So it's not one size fit all for each one. We have to look at them individually to see how much water we could retain. It's not quite that easy of each one they're all kind of the same. They're not. They're very different.
All right. And then the last question before I turn it back to the regular flow was whether or not the tide gates are passive or if they have to be manually closed.
They're passive. We inspect them, so they open and close regularly. They do not have to be, there's not controls that implement them. But they are inspected regularly by our operations department to make sure that they're in functioning condition. And if they need to be, work needs to be done to maintain them, it's done.
All right. I see a couple more questions coming in, but I'm going to let you go back to your regular stuff and we'll come back to some of these to make sure.
Okay, thank you. So what I was mentioning was this time we went back to our model. We wanted to make it a dynamic model. And what I mean by that is
Charlie, you might be frozen.
play a little thing here so you can kind of get an idea what I'm talking about.
Charlie, you froze and all we got was a dynamic model.
Alice?
I've got you, Charlie. It's Bud.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me go back a little bit on this dynamic model because it's very important for anyone who missed it. What we did is now we made where the pipes are moving the water as well. So last time I said the water was static, it didn't move, we just poured it on there. During this model, the pipes are moving the water and we added a 2D component to where the surface is also moving the water. So the water can move in the pipes and overland, where it wasn't doing that before. I'm going to try this again. So this is what we're talking about, where the water is moving during this process. All right. The other thing that we did is we were like kids in the candy store. And we said, okay, what kind of storms do we want to run? So we picked the big ones that we were talking about with the mayor, but we also picked other ones. We picked thunderstorms, where we could be very intense, very quick events. We picked frontal systems, where we have cold air masses coming through. We have hurricanes, and we have nor'easters. Now we broke these up because it's very important of how the storm moves across the city of Boston. We took that into consideration. So some storms come from the south, come from the northeast, they come from different directions. And that will play a significant role in how the storm surge impacts the city. What we did with this is we worked with Steve Miller over at Mass DOT. Now, Steve was working with Woods Hole Group to develop model runs for their project. Because we wanted to be consistent, we also worked with Woods Hole Group to use the same information that Woods Hole Group was developing for Mass DOT and used it in our model. We want this to be consistent so that as we talk with other agencies, the information is comparable. So that was very important. We worked with Woods Hole Group, got the boundary conditions that were developed for Mass DOT and used those as our boundary conditions in our model. Now, these are the storms that we looked at. We looked at storms in 2030, 2070. We looked at sea level rise, storm surge. So these are all the storms that we ran through our program. I want to show it a little another way. And I'm putting this up here twice for a reason. So the storms had different durations. So if you look at them, you'll see different durations, different depths, but also very important was the hydrograph of the storm. Now, what the hydrograph is how the rain falls during a rain event. And this can become very important in that stormwater detention project. Some of the rain events, the rain occurs at the beginning of the storm, some at the middle, some towards the end. So it's not always clear that when you have a major event occurring, you can sit there and say, okay, we're going to detain stormwater at the beginning of the rain event. Sometimes you don't want to do that. You want to let the pipe flow and then implement the stormwater detentions during the storm. So it's very important to do the analysis of how the rain's falling, when the rain's falling, and where the rain's falling, so we can make all these processes work together to get the maximum benefit. As I
And
mentioned,
Charlie, what
yes,
did the
ma'am.
scenario, someone asked what the scenarios do to sea level rise? Like, how did you decide to pair this amount of sea level rise with this kind of storm?
The sea level rise is consistent. So the sea level rise in 2030, we have a consistent value. The ones that change are the storms and the surge, because the surge can come at different elevations in the harbor based upon which way the wind is occurring. That answer the question? So the sea level rise is consistent. I'll show you that in a little bit. But this is what I'm talking about with the storms coming different ways across the city. This gives you an idea of the hydrographs of those storms and what we looked at. Now, because we had the 2D component, there was an unbelievable amount of computing that went behind this. So in order to make this work, Hazen and Sawyer is the firm that helped us do this inundation model. And they had to break the city up into sections in order to run the model. And those sections were taken out. A storm event was put on that 2D mesh, that 2D component of the thing. The model was run, and then the information was put together. To give you an idea of how long this took, one section of this inundation, those zones you're looking at, and one storm event took 60 hours of computing time. There was a lot of computation that went behind this. Hazen and Sawyer had to develop about 7 virtual computers in order to run this. They leased space on an Amazon server that had enough power to run this thing. And then we spent months running all these storms and putting the information back together again. Now, the 2D mesh was also, sorry about that, a dynamic process. So first they came up with what they thought was the 2D mesh based upon the topography. As they ran the storms, they then adjusted the 2D mesh as they got more information about the inundation.
What do you mean by 1D, 2D, and 3D?
Oh, okay, thank you. So the 1D, this very important, the 1D, this was one thing I majorly learned about in this process, very interesting. So a 1D model just takes the water down the pipe if a pipe is surcharged, meaning the water is coming out of it. In a 1D model, the surcharge comes out of the manhole. What a 2D component does is allows that water to spread overland. Now the land is also moving that water. And that's why the 2D component is very important. What they created was 30 square foot sections where the water would come out of the pipe or stay on the ground, and it would move from cell to cell. So that's why this thing is dynamic is important, is because the water was both moving in the pipes, and a 2D mesh allowed the water to flow overland from cell to cell and move it around. Where this becomes important, what I found very interesting, and we talked about earlier the static model where it showed conservative inundation. We would have water come out of a manhole and just show up. When you added the 2D component, the flooding would move a little bit. Because the water was released, some manholes would still be surcharged and coming out, but other ones would no longer be surcharged because the water had a release, was able to spread overland. It was very interesting to watch and kind of confusing, but Ben did a great job of helping me get through this and try to explain it to me.
Is the porosity of the ground taken into account?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that one on the top of my head. I don't think we have the soil characteristics in our model yet.
Good question, Stephanie.
Yes. All right, what I'm going to do now, I got to minimize this. Hang on. Oh. We'll come back to this. What I want to do now.
Charlie, as you go to your digital model that you're going to show us, we've gotten a lot of questions about colors. Should people be worried about what colors they're seeing, or just sort of know that there are ways to show differentiation?
There are ways to show different inundations. I happen to use the red and the blues. That's pure what I use for those inundations.
But some maps have pink and some maps have
Well,
yellow.
they do. Yes. Yeah, it's just the way the maps, some people have different preferences.
Okay.
Are you seeing the inundation model?
Yes.
Okay. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of what we developed. Now, this is a tool, and right now we are in the process of figuring out how to put this on the commission's website so people can access this. We're working on that now. It's going to take us a little bit of time. We're working with Hazen. We're working with our IT department. What are we going to need to do in order to put this on our website so people can access it? That's in process. But how this works is you'll have a link, you go to it. And there's a thing at the beginning that talks about the storms like I showed you. It kind of gives you the background. And then as you get to the bottom, you'll see this model. So what you can do is you can pick different storms. We talked about the 4 different types of storms we have. You can pick a return frequency. Now, one thing we added, some people get fixated on, is the 10-year, 100-year, 500-year event. We got that. But what we added is, when we talk about this, how much rain are we talking about? So it makes it easier for people to see this. I know when I go to NOAA, I don't see, oh, there's a 100-year event coming. It's how much rain is going to be falling. So sometimes it's easier to go to this. Also, we put down here, how long of event are we talking about here? Now, one of the things is, so you can pick the event, and then you pick the sea level rise. Now, what's important here is our design standards call for a 10-year storm. If you look, we're looking at 10-year storm in the future, and there's not a lot of, we're doing pretty good looking at this stuff. But what gets interesting is as you change sea level rise, now you start seeing more of an impact. So what's interesting from what we've seen so far is our system does pretty good with a 10-year storm. It's the sea level rise that can impact us significantly with inundation. Now, you keep seeing these little yellow dots that pop up. One of the things we wanted to do was to show visually, what are we talking about here? So the thing that we did with our model, before you would just have those dots that have the color. Well, now you can zoom in and you can see the hexagram, the shapes come up, and it will show you how deep the water will be at that spot. So you can go around and search that. Now, the other thing we did is we picked about 20 sites around the city, and we had 360-degree pictures made. If there's over 6 inches of inundation and less than 6 feet, a yellow dot will appear, and you can click it. We seen that? Alice?
Yeah.
Okay, and a picture will come up. what does that inundation look like? So we added this for education. When we talk about this inundation, we give these figures. This is what it looks like.
And Charlie, can you scroll back and show people how the information is also visually overlaid when you're in that future world?
Yep, I will. Okay. But different things. So you can go to different spots. See, what Alice was talking about is right here. It gives you the parameters of the storm. So you can see this is the storm event that's occurring that does this. One of the things that's important about this is we want to be able to educate. There's sometimes when you get some inundation and it's low, you could get through it, especially with trucks with big wheels, could. There's times you can't. So if you go here, it gives you an idea. Where's the water, extent of the water? How deep is it? Now, we added another component to this. If you flip a switch, you can compare both years. If you change one, the other one changes. So you can see what is the difference in 2030 and 2070 with the sea level rise. Now, let's go to another one, like a nor'easter. You can have a 50-year event, have sea level rise. Now we can add storm surge. We can turn it on, turn it off. Different ways to show information about what we're looking at and how to present it. If you notice over here, we have the facilities that are going to be impacted. What I also want to show you is another tool we developed. Now, the inundation model is going to be on our website. This other tool is really for other public agencies. What do we expect to be impacted from them? One of the things the mayor said is he wanted to know how many people are going to be impacted, the critical facilities are going to be impacted, how long, how deep, all that information. So we developed a Power BI tool to show that information. It's a business interface tool that presents the data for these inundations, what's going to be impacted. So here, if you just, you can pick a storm, and it lists the facilities that are going to be impacted. It gives you the average duration that they're going to be impacted, what's the maximum depth at that facility, what's the average depth at that facility. So you can pick different storms. You can pick it by 2030, 2070. You can pick different neighborhoods. You can also pick different entities in here and say, if you're specifically interested in which one, it'll come up for you. Others can show the population that are being impacted, critical facilities that are in each area, and the risk scores. I find, the inundation overview is a very powerful tool to show you which one you can zoom in. Now, right now, it does not have the inundation model overlaid with the facilities being done. That's being worked on. It has to do with some stuff between BI and Esri, but that's being looked at. Let me see. I think, does anyone have any other questions right now on this?
We have lots of questions if you want to pause. One of the biggest questions that multiple people have asked is if this slide deck can be available later or if they have to wait until the flood model that you're showing is public.
The slide deck is going to be available through Boston Harbor Now, what I'm showing you today.
Okay.
The inundation model will be available on the commission's website. So you're not going to be able to go to the inundation model through the presentation.
Yep.
But the
So-
slides, I already sent them to you, so you can post them.
Great. Anyone who wants them can check with me, and we'll also try to find a way to post them as well. And then in the model itself, there were specific questions about, like, does this represent this plus this plus this? Like Chris Bush asked, is it 10% rain event plus 1% sea level rise plus 2070? It's just, the answer is yes if those are the options you pick, but you can keep picking different options.
Yes. Now, some people are talking about the design storms and stuff like that. I think what's important here is, let's go back to what the mayor asked for. If we want to make sure this tool was looking at a very specific thing. The mayor asked for who's going to be impacted, for how long, that stuff. That's what we wanted to get into, was public safety. Where could we see problems? For how long? Where do we need to get people from? Where do we take them to? Now, the other thing that's very important with this tool, and this is where the other agencies in Climate Ready Boston comes into account. You've seen with Climate Ready Boston, they've looked at different neighborhoods and they have proposed different barriers. What you're seeing is if we do nothing, this is as is of right now. Now, if Climate Ready Boston starts working forward with their barriers, this will be changed. And we're going to be looking at that, which I'll get into next. But it's very important is hopefully this tool shows how important the work that Climate Ready Boston is doing and those barriers and the work it needs to do to protect the overland flow from inundation. So this tool needs to go with that to show how they go together. It's also very important for that tool to work with the Boston Fire Department, Boston Police, health clinics. How are we going to work with evacuation, access to things? I mean, it's going to be very important with the fire department and the police department. How are they going to be impacted? EMS, all of that. It's going to be very important with that. So where are we going with this? This is kind of a preliminary heat map of where we expect to see inundations and problems. So a project that we're just getting underway with is a coastal stormwater discharge analysis. And what that is as we've talked about, we have a sea level rise. We could have a storm with a sea level rise and a storm surge and a high tide where our tide gates are closed. We have a lot of water against them. It's going to be very hard for the pipes to be able to discharge stormwater, to push against that tide to get the water out. So we're going to have more problems. So we want to look at, identify those areas where we could have problems and what do we need to do? Could it be storage conduits that we store stormwater and then get it out? Could it be pump stations? We're not sure yet. That's what we're starting to look at is what's the next step of, we have coastal barriers going in, we have the tide gates that are preventing water, we're trying to retain stormwater, but we are still going to have rain events. How does the commission maintain its responsibility to capability to discharge stormwater during major events to help address flooding? That's our next project to look at. So we want to also look at, it's very important to work with the city, say, as you're proposing barriers, we need to look at those and take those into account for these things and coordinate. Where do we need to do work in conjunction with that? And how is that going to impact the inundation? An example of that is Fort Point Channel. Now, this area drains about 9% of the city of Boston goes to Fort Point Channel. Now, the city is looking at putting a barrier around Fort Point Channel so the higher ocean does not spread out laterally over from Fort Point Channel. But as the tide is high and as a rain event, it does not help us with stormwater going out of those pipes. Because we have about 60, there's about 60 outfalls along Fort Point Channel. And they're not all the commissions. This is the other thing that's important. The commissions, there's other agencies, there's private entities. All of us have water that's going into Fort Point Channel. if we just put the barrier around here, those outfalls are going to be impacted. So what we want to look at is, do we need to put a storage conduit around Fort Point Channel to gather that water and pump it out? Or another thing we've been looking at is, could you put a deployable barrier along the mouth of Fort Point Channel? This is something that stays down. But if you know a major event is going to occur, could you sit there during a low tide, let the tide go out of Fort Point Channel, deploy the barrier so the tide does not come back in? You now have a basin that the stormwater could drain into. From 90% of the city, they could drain into this thing just like it does now. We did a preliminary analysis, and if we did it now with no pumps, we could hold a 10-year event in the Fort Point Channel. Now in 2030, 2035, it goes down because of sea level rise. But that's without pumps. If we add pumps, we can now allow all of that area to drain into Fort Point Channel and push the water out. Again, it's very important that I talk about is we have Climate Ready Boston looking at their improvements. We need to work with them very closely. One, we have several locations that we are not putting tide gates in because if we put a tide gate in, it would be bypassed by overland flow. But if the city puts in a barrier, we need to make sure that our tide gate is lined up with their barrier so they can work in conjunction with each other. If they're not lined and we have things in between, we don't want anything to bypass each other. They need to work in connection with each other. When I talked about the coastal stormwater discharge, we need to identify locations where we may need to do something in the future to allow us to have the capability to discharge stormwater. It could be storage conduits. It could be pump stations. We don't know. But it's easier to find that out now and select those sites so we can identify them now. And as the city is redoing redevelopment, don't have a new development go in a spot that we might need. Or we need to work with them saying, we need something here. Hold us a spot. We don't know now or in the future when we need to do this. But we want to lay out a situation now where we can think about it now and pre-identify these spots so we can get ready for it and make it easier to implement down the road. It's going to make it cheaper and much more effective as opposed to building something and then saying, well, that's where we needed to go and now we're out of luck. We need to make sure that we're working with all the other agencies. What are they doing? How does this all fit together so we can protect the city? A couple other things that we're working on I want to give you kind of a background on is this is a project, it's the Dorchester Interceptor. This is the pipe that goes from Hyde Park up to about South Boston to discharge. The pipe is about 4 miles long. It ranges in size from 54 to 60 inches. Now, when the commission in the past has monitored a pipe, we'll put meters in for about 12 weeks and hope we get a storm. We've had some issues with this pipe. So what we've decided to do is to monitor this pipe over an extended period of time. So we started out by putting about 15 sensors along this pipe. We put flow meters, we put level sensors. The intent here is to monitor this pipe during rain events and see how it operates. The goal is to help teach the staff, here's how our system functions during different rain events. If we're monitoring it for a 3-year period, we'll get different rain events and we can see how each one impacts the system differently. We're also developing an interface so that this information comes back to the commission in real time so we can monitor it here, what is going on out in the field, so we can deploy things as we need them. So we're doing this in Dorchester now. We're in about a 2nd year of this thing. We're trying out different sensors too. We're redeploying some that have better battery life, better response time. We're trying out different things to say, okay, what is the best way we can monitor our system? We're also doing this in the Stony Brook conduit area near the Forest Hills T station. We picked 6 locations where we have put sensors in, where we can see how the system responds during rain events and what information can we get out there readily. This is on a trial basis. We're working with this now. And one of the things we've learned and that we've talked to these metering companies about is they can absolutely control the weather. We put these in about 2 months ago, and we haven't seen any rain since. And if you watch the radar, you can see how storms change. And I keep talking to Xylem, saying, I can't believe you guys can control the weather so well that after you put these sensors in, we're not getting any good data anymore. We need to know how these pipes work. But it never fails as you put meters in, you don't get any more rain after that.
Hey, Charlie, this
Yes.
is Bud. Bud, can I interject just with a historical question? How much more water do we get on an annual basis than we used to? I think I once saw a graph you guys had that, I don't know, 40 years ago, we got 42 or 45 inches a year rain. Now we get 50 something. What,
Yes, that's right.
is that close? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what's interesting is it's how the rain falls. So intensity can really impact us. If we get 1/4 of an inch of rain in 15 minutes, that can have a huge impact on getting the water in. If we have 1/4 of an inch over 24 hours, that's okay. So there's a lot of things we need to learn about is as we get these different quantities, it impacts our system differently, and it impacts it differently in different locations. So we want to get a much better understanding of how do these things impact our system. They're changing. We need to keep up with monitoring. What do those changes mean? And with that, we can open up to questions.
Give me 1 second.
So Charlie, while Alice is configuring the system there, it sounds to me like not only are we getting more rainfall, but we're getting a more intense rainfall, which the Europeans call cloudburst.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, last summer was interesting it's also highly, highly localized.
Yeah.
Last time we had in Dorchester, we would have cloudburst. It was just Dorchester. We had this summer, there were some people and I working on monitoring these things, and it was absolutely pouring at my house and at Dimitri's house. And we were sitting there watching, just like, this is unbelievable to watch. It did not show up on any of our rain gauges. It was so localized. And that was also very interesting is how do we get information on that when these cloudbursts, like you said, can be so localized, but they're not picked up with our rain gauge network.
Thank you.
So there's a few things I want to go through here. John Sullivan, who works with you, has added some questions to the Q&A, but it's really more like clarification. So I want to go through and make sure that people have those points of clarification. One thing he noted was that not all areas of the city were modeled in 2D. For instance, flooding on Spring Street in West Roxbury occurs during extreme events, but was modeled because it's an isolated area.
Correct.
Another note that John said, Spring Street was not modeled, nor other hilly areas. And I think that gets back to a question that we got, which was about, there's sort of gaps between your zones. Someone asked, there's a gap between zone 6 and 3 that's sort of missing. Is that just an elevation question? Or?
Elevation, that's an excellent way to put it. Because of the topography in Boston, the water, like John said, there's spots where the water comes out, but it may not be widespread. So we did that with the topography. Where do we need to develop the 2D mesh? When you develop this 2D mesh, the computational requirement just goes up unbelievably. So we had to pick lines of where do you develop the 2D mesh and where don't you develop the 2D mesh. So the topography plays a major role in that. It's kind of interesting is if you go back to the map I showed you with the 2D mesh, if you plugged in the original Boston into that back in the 1630, it's amazing how much it matches with the South Boston was not, it's a filled in area.
There's a similar question maybe a little bit different about, was there a reason why the Muddy River watershed was not looked at as part of the detention site study, but it was prioritized for the Stony Brook watershed?
The Stony Brook drain, let me see if I get this question right. The Stony Brook drain, such a significant portion of the city of Boston, we need to understand, sorry, that drains like a quarter to a third of the city of Boston. We really want to understand how does that system respond during major events. The other thing I'll go back to is the stormwater detention. When we first started looking at some of these sites, we took one of them. One of them was the Arboretum, and we plugged it into the inundation model, saying we were talking we could retain with all sorts of work about 45 acre-feet of water. So it's a lot of water. What we wanted to see is, does that have an impact on the inundation? And when we did it, we didn't see any impact. And so our first thing was like, this model, what's going on here with it? This is not right. So we did a whole lot more research on it. Well, it turns out with the Stony Brook system, there's 3 branches to it. And where we were looking on was on the Rosendale branch. The flows coming down the Stony Brook branch were so much, it was masking the improvements that the Arboretum was making on the inundation. We then added all 10 sites into the model, and we started seeing some improvement. We then added real-time controls to those 10 sites, and then we started seeing some significant improvements. What this showed us is it's going to take a lot of these things, and they have to work in conjunction with each other. It's not just one and done. It's going to take many of these things to help make a major impact on the stormwater detention. So we want to get an idea of how can we monitor the system and get this information. Our goal here is to eventually roll out more sensors around the city and possibly put it anywhere from 50 to 75 all across the major pipes of the city so that we can monitor it during major events. And we get more understanding. How does this stuff work and interact with each other? Does that answer the question that was asked?
I think so.
Okay.
I think, it was one area versus another.
Yes, yeah. No, it's just more of, we're trying to see what sensors work out there. What can people do? What do we want? What do we like? We're going to put out RFP to do more of these later on. What do we want? And so we're trying to figure out what's out there and what do we want to get out of this.
There are several questions about other municipalities, both adjacent and nearby. One person asked if the model takes into account the city's impact on other cities' impact on flooding. And this example is, what about water moving from Charlestown Sullivan Square into Cambridge and back into the Charles River?
This is an excellent question. We did not do that. First, we just wanted to develop this for us. That was our first thing. But we wanted to develop a tool that, it may not be the commission, it may be another agency that expands this and uses this platform to do a wider analysis. We don't know that yet. But the whole reason we want to present this out there is this tool exists. Other agencies, if they like this, they don't need to redevelop their own tool. Do we expand this to make it more of a regional analysis tool? That's one of the discussions we've been having.
Great. That also answers the other question. Are there future plans to combine Boston's maps with surrounding municipalities? So, Cambridge, Brookline, and Somerville, they can sort of buy into the map.
We have to work that all out because, the commission did it for the commission in the city of Boston. The mayor asked for this, we developed it for him. But are we going to start doing inundation models for all the surrounding communities? We're not a regional agency. So there's kind of a fine line there. But you're right.
There's the potential.
Tied in with Boston, all that stuff. Yes.
And then I think there's one more other question about municipalities. I don't see it now, but I feel like, is there something to look at sea level rise and storm surge in other areas like Gloucester? Or is this is really just Boston and other cities have to figure stuff out?
For this project, we use Boston, but I do know that the best person to ask for that is Steve Miller with his work with Mass DOT and work with Woods Hole Group. They are developing this information for other areas. So it's actually Woods Hole Group and Mass DOT. Woods Hole Group has a lot of this base information. We used theirs for consistency purposes. We did not develop it specifically for our project. We wanted to use something that was already developed so that we could match with other agencies.
It also, this is one more on the geography. It appears that the model viewer stopped short of Orient Heights, some point around Constitution Beach. Will that area be covered?
I've asked that question, and Ben has given me an answer, and I just cannot remember off the top of my head of why there's a line there. I just cannot remember exactly why that line is there.
I don't know if you know, but someone has just asked, how much would it cost for a municipality to expand on this since you guys have done so much of the legwork?
I do not know the answer.
Yeah,
to that.
it was a question, so I'm asking it, but I understand why you wouldn't know that. Because I'm sure there's lots of variables. There have been a lot of questions that have come in specifically about the Fort Point channel.
Yeah.
Someone noted, if you're storing fresh water in the Fort Point channel during a retention event, would that kill off any of the marine life who expect to be in salt water?
We'll have to look. I mean, right now, so there's still going to be ocean water in there now because it's never going to empty because there's still a bottom to it and stuff. And the thing is, it's how often is this going to be deployed? It's not going to be deployed during every event. It's during major events. So it's not one of those things of this is consistent deployed 5 times a year. It may be every 20 years. We don't know yet. We have to look at, is this feasible? We don't even know. We're trying to figure out what could be done to help this situation.
Yeah, so there are two sort of parallel questions to that. One person asks if you can explain how the berm project would impact stormwater. Do you think it would exacerbate it? Or you just don't know? So
there's a couple options here. One is the outfalls go all around the 4-point channel. Now we could put conduits to intercept that water and then pump it out. I don't even know if there's enough room to put those conduits in there. But another option is, can we put a barrier? And what it would allow is that the ocean water would not come back in. This is essentially would be like the lower Charles River Basin, what we have now with that dam. It's an area where the water could drain into and then be pumped out of. So it's very similar setup, except for a permanent dam, it would be a deployable barrier where the water would drain into it and then be pumped out.
Great. Pallavi, you've asked a question about Alston. I promise to come back to that. I see you're in the chat. On one more on the Fort Point channel, there's the study about the climate ready study seems to have taken that idea of putting a barrier off the table. Is it that you guys are saying keep it on the table, or for sure it's the right idea, or it sounds like it needs more study. You just don't want it to not be studied.
And that's the whole point of this coastal stormwater discharge analysis. All these things need more study. What's feasible? What could happen? The whole point of that study is each one of these is where are we vulnerable and what potential improvements could be made to address this. We haven't selected anything. It's just first we have to where are these problems and what could potentially be implemented. We don't know. That's what the whole point of this is identify where it's the next level. How do we maintain our capability to discharge stormwater?
Yeah. And then do you know who owns you said the outfalls are owned by more than just you guys. Do you guys know who owns what? Are they mapped?
They are mapped. We know the commissions and we know other agency outfalls. We are not very good at the private outfalls. That's where a lot of information is missing is who owns the private outfalls along the 4-point channel, and there are several of them. Great. But yes, we have identified the commissions. We know Mass DOT has some. We have those demarcated. It's the private ones that could be a problem.
Excellent. I'm going to go back to some mishmash of big picture and earlier questions that we got. One earlier question was about the North Alston area. So way back, you showed that map. I think there were some questions right at the time. That was definitely a map people were like, what do these colors mean?
Are we talking?
Yep, this one, perfect.
Okay. So that is water that's flowing over land?
The blue.
The blue.
What does yellow versus pink mean?
Oh, sorry. Those are our pipes.
And they're both pipes, yellow and pink?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Some are sewer, some are drain. Sorry, that's a good question.
Also on this map, there was a question about how are you getting Harvard and MassDOT to deal with precipitation-based flooding, given their need to for compliance. How will surface-based green infrastructure strategies be deployed?
The commission, okay, so the green infrastructure, and I'm going to use them. The commission has what we call a GSA, a General Service Application Process. When a site is being done for development or redevelopment and it's impacting our system, those entities have to come in to the commission and submit a site plan for review. And in that, we have them retaining stormwater for the green infrastructure component. So based upon the size of the project, they can retain an inch and a quarter. Now that green infrastructure is going in for water quality purposes, but it is still retaining stormwater. And we are going to be putting all that stuff into the model to say, okay, we're taking all this stuff out, but those are not really for stormwater quantity purposes. Those are for stormwater quality purposes. So we have to look at each one's a little different of what we're doing here. So how we get some of this other stuff in is through our general service application process that puts a requirement on them is as they're doing something, if they want their water turned on, there's certain requirements they have to fulfill.
Great. We've got some real nerds here asking some questions. I think some of it you discussed, but I want to make sure we've got the answer officially. One asked about the typical design storms, and they specifically asked, was it something like the NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall distribution duration and cumulative depths model, or other like standardized design storms? And do you think realistic results were obtained?
Okay, very good questions. We did use Atlas 14 information. We have run design storms through it, but it's not on this model. What you're seeing right here is major storm events to answer the question that the mayor had. We are looking at doing the design storms next in the process, saying, okay, we do have these requirements. What happens with those? Those are being developed. We have some of them now, but not on the inundation model. How realistic? I think this is one of the best tools we have right now. I think that a lot of effort was put into this to make sure that we had the most up-to-date information. The pipes were right, the topography, we looked at LiDAR. I think we got a lot of good information on this thing.
Yeah. Someone asked a similar question in terms of have the model projections been validated against documented inland flooding? For example, the modeled flooding along Eastie's waterfront has already happened.
I'm not sure about the answer to that question. I know we have where we had flooding before, we are seeing it there, but I haven't done a complete analysis of, okay, they match exactly. I don't know the validation. If I can answer the question, how much has that been validated?
Yeah. We got a note from John Sullivan saying that about Harvard, that the commission is working with Harvard to install an 84-inch storm conduit to alleviate surface flooding, all on their own dime, and they will also infiltrate the first 1.25 inches of rain.
Yes.
So that's the other official answer to that.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to the hydrologic model you're using? It sounds like who's running the model is the Woods Hole group, but someone asked that, and I just want to make sure that's right.
Okay, so the model that the commission ran was a PC swim model. That's what the commission typically has. So we have that. What we used for the Woods Hole group was their output file, and they have a whole different, I think it's called an AdCirc model. We use the output from their model. So it's not the same thing. So we use PC swim with our sewer and drain system, and we use the output file. I'm pretty sure it's an AdCirc model from Woods Hole group. You use their stuff. It's a whole different type of model and put it together. Exactly.
Great. Back when you were showing one of the coolest things about the tool you developed was those 20 sites where you can drop the pin and see the water come up. Someone asked if that visualization is based on floodwater coming in or stormwater that can't release due
Both.
to the height of the ocean, or both?
Both. So it's however the water's there in that depth, it converts it to that picture.
And so that also means that we might see both overland flooding and then stuff coming up through the storm drains.
Then yes, that's the whole thing about the dynamic thing, is it all goes together.
Yep. This is all people asking very similar questions in the same moment.
Hey, Alice, can I
Yes,
interject a little
absolutely, Bud.
bit? Exercise my role as the host. Charlie, I don't know if you can answer this question, but what you guys are doing is incredibly sophisticated analysis here. I always feel like I'm a happy taxpayer when I hear you and John talk, because this is really well done. And if for people who don't know, Boston Water and Sewers is leading the country in a lot of this work around the future impacts of climate change, which is great. Do you have any idea, Charlie, to prepare to do what we might need to do by 2050 or even 2070? Are we talking capital projects that total in the tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, or billions of dollars?
I couldn't even hazard a guess,
Yeah.
but I do want to stop one thing is you raised the point. We have a lot of good people. We have unbelievable consultants helping us with this stuff. This is not just the commission doing this. We have great consultants who are helping us. There's a lot of staff here working on this stuff. There's a lot of big effort going on behind this thing to make this stuff work. I appreciate that, but I definitely want to give major kudos to a lot of the consultants out there who are helping us with this stuff. There's a lot of them. What's interesting with what you just asked is, I think what's interesting is climate change is going to impact different sections of the country in different ways. We're being impacted completely differently than California. I mean, it's night and day. Like we were talking about earlier, down south with the lack of rain. We get the rain, they don't get any of the rain. We have coastal flooding. It's such a wide disparity how this is going to impact different parts. Now in Boston, it's a good thing and a bad thing. We're focused on the sewer and drain system. But the nice thing is in Boston, each entity is targeted with doing their things. What the mayor's done is, so like the Boston Health Department is charged with doing the heat island impact. What we have to do is connect and say, okay, you're doing something and we're doing something. Let's take into consideration the Boston Public Health Department. They're trying to work on the heat island effect and say, okay, we need to plant trees in order to address the heat island effect. We're sitting there saying, wait a minute, let's work together here. If we can then take those trees and install green infrastructure, we can help address our stormwater quality purposes, give the trees some water, and you guys can help your heat island effect. We need to work with each other to say, is there multiple benefits that by implementing this stuff, we can gather from it?
There's a really high level question, I think maybe similar to this. And again, because we get the rain, someone asked, is there any consideration about collecting that rainwater for reuse during droughts rather than, trying to pump it out to a watershed or to a river?
We have, and the thing is, we were talking about this a little bit before this presentation started. The Boston area is so fortunate is that we have an abundant water supply, and we have extremely high quality water. I mean, I give the MWA unbelievable kudos for how they run that system. I mean, our water is unbelievable. We don't lack for water right now.
Yeah. Great. It looks like I got that question in the chat. I'm trying to follow the chat in the Q&A, but the chat is adding another layer. I do want to note, Julie Wood wrote that the Charles River watershed communities are developing a precipitation-based flood model this winter, spring. So I'm guessing that's, starting in the future, but soon. And it says, looks like they're looking forward to collaborating with you on this. So that's great. I also got a note from Joe Christo saying that the Fort Point channel, I'm going to find Joe and I'm going to let you say your
Go and talk.
So, Joe.
Hey, Charlie, how you doing?
Hey, Joe.
Great presentation as always. This is incredible work.
Thanks.
The 4-point channel question from Deanna was a good one, and just wanted to make sure we addressed that thoroughly. And you know, feel free to cite the work that Hazen did that we submitted to FEMA that showed that the berm is not in fact making the stormwater situation worse, and if anything is helping it out. Just wanted to plug that and say that's something that we can feel free to discuss too.
Great.
Leaving that up to you, Charlie, if you want to go.
No, we got it. No, you and I, we go about that. I got it.
Awesome.
Do you want to add anything, Charlie?
No, I don't. I mean, I think Joe was just. We've been talking with Joe and the city quite a bit about this. Is we just know we have to look at it. This is part of our analysis? I was talking about is what are we going to do around the coast of the city to address this stuff?
Yep. And then I also have the world's longest question from Steve Hollinger. So Steve, I'm going to actually allow you to talk. So when I hit the screen, you can ask your question because I don't think I'm going to do it justice.
Hi, I really appreciate this presentation forum and also the work of the BWSC. My question is this, BWSC is responsible for managing water below grade. Is there a reason why we have not been seeing planning by BPDA at grade in each Boston subdistrict for stormwater unable to drain with sea level rise? Doesn't living with water require inland planning to manage anticipated volumes of water? I'm recently hearing pumps being mentioned as a means to remove floodwater inland, but are pumps capable and or cost effective as a solution citywide? Thank you.
Oh, good questions. We do work with BPDA, and they do have in their review requirements that they have to take climate change into consideration in their review process. I do not want to speak for BPDA at all, but I do know that they take this very seriously, and in their design, the review criteria, climate change is a required aspect that the things have to look at. With the pumps, it goes back to Boston. We try everything we can not to put in pumps. Gravity, as John's always said, gravity works great. Pumps are maintenance, there's power, they can go down, all this stuff. If we can use gravity to any extent, we will, because it stays with us and keeps on going. But sometimes we know it might be necessary, and we can't take anything off the table. Our thing is to say, what do we need to look at possibly that could help us with this situation? Our thing now is we don't want to go in with kind of closed saying it'll never work. We're trying to get an idea of what do we need to think about long term to address this situation. Does that answer the question, I hope?
I think that's a good answer. I also want to note, we've got a couple things happening here. John Sullivan is texting me that storage is expensive and requires land area.
Yes.
And that the coastal study that you guys are working on will look at grade flooding and the need for pumps.
Exactly.
So someone has asked multiple times in the Q&A, an anonymous attendee has resubmitted the two questions that I don't think you can answer right now, which is how many new pump stations are you forecasting to need to respond to sea level rise and to 1% storm events?
Good question. We don't know yet, because our first step is where are we vulnerable? How many spots are we vulnerable for this inland flooding and stuff? We don't know that yet. The other thing that's very important with this is Climate Ready Boston with their barriers. We need to lay out a plan all along the coast, who's doing what and where are we vulnerable. We don't have that number yet. That's part of this study, is to identify the spots and get an idea of what could be needed.
Yeah.
Alex?
Yes, Bud.
Just to follow on that, I do know from all the Climate Ready Boston neighborhood plans that have been developed, even though they don't know exactly what might be needed and how it might be designed to handle the freshwater runoff, as Charlie's discussed here, they did include, I think it's 5%, maybe 10% of the cost figures. There was an extra 5 or 10% added to provide, to account for the fact that money will need to be spent on the purposes Charlie's talking about. Whether that's enough or not, I don't know. But
Yeah.
If you look at some of the numbers for 4-point channel, it's $50 to $100 million to do the buffer barrier work. 5% of that is another $5 million to handle the kind of stuff Charlie's talking about. So at least there's a placeholder number in there, which is helpful.
Right. And Stephanie wrote a note to us, that noting that portions of Boston will be below sea level in the future. So much like the Netherlands, at some point we will need pumps to offset that whenever that situation is created.
Right.
Oops, I lost the question I was going to next. Is it the intent to update this model as new projects come online? Like if there is a new coastal resilience thing that's being designed, you're planning to keep updating the model iteratively with those?
Good question. Not that specifically, but yes, this model. So right now we want to get this out there and see what people say. And we're taking in what do people like about it? What other things they want to see? Our intent is, yes, to rerun this possibly every 5 years. What we do know is we make changes to our system. This model will need to be updated and recalibrated as we change our system. Then, as these other projects go in, we need to rerun these scenarios to say, what impacts do these things have? So we won't run it on a per project basis, but we will run some stuff to say, okay, will these improvements help? We are going to be looking at with Climate Ready Boston as they're looking at their barriers. What do they have? The problem is that the computational requirement of this program is unbelievable. And so it's not something you just plug in and go, okay, I'm going to go run you for the night. That's the extent of our problem is running this thing takes a lot of computational capability and stuff. And if somebody has a supercomputer they want to give us, man, I'm on board. You got it. Give me one. I'll take it. It's a complex model, and it's not quite that easy to do it as project specific as people are asking.
Great. I got another inside scoop from John Sullivan, noting that you guys already do deal with a certain amount of below grade area that needs to be pumped.
Yeah.
So the South End is protected by the Union Park pump station since 1913, which needs to run when he says there's overwhelming flood intensity or an extreme high tide that won't let the water drain out by gravity. So
our intent is this model is not done. We will be utilizing it, maintaining it, keeping it for our use. I mean, we made a major investment, and we do intend on keeping it up to date and updating it as it needs to be. The thing that's very important when somebody says the green infrastructure goes in, we need to see where are we in not only our stormwater quality, but the stormwater detention. What are we seeing? Is this stuff having impacts? We have to keep analyzing that.
Yeah. This is I've got a couple of big questions. Based on the modeling, which do you think is the greater threat, intense rainfall or sea level rise? Is there a one or the other that's worse?
My personal opinion is sea level rise, because that's consistent, that's recurring all the time, and it'll be systemic. I mean, let's look at the Morrissey Boulevard and then down by UMass Boston. We get those more and more frequently, and that's going to happen. It's a consistent, recurring event.
I might just add, if I might, Alice, and correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie, but in your charts kind of show this, nor'easters is also our big problem here in New England as opposed to hurricanes that you see down south, at least at the present time, right?
Yes.
Because they last through several days and go through several tide cycles.
But it's also not only that, it's the way the water is coming up. So with a hurricane, it's coming up from the south, and it hits the Fall River Cape area first, and that blunts the water. Whereas a nor'easter is coming directly into the harbor, and it's just coming straight at us. You're right. It's a different way the water is approaching us. That's very important.
Great. We've got some super specific things that were like, when you showed something in the model, they were like, what happens to that? What happens to that?
We get a lot of that. I do it.
Yep. John also has a side note for us that intense rainfall near the Arboretum can impact Archdale area of Roslindale, even though they are 40 feet above sea level, any sea level impact. So there are parts of the city where it's not universal that one thing is worse than the other. It seems like when you showed stuff that's happening very soon in your interactive model, that there were some areas that that even without sea level rise, there are issues. So one says, the model shows a thunderstorm with a 10-year amount of rainfall, 3.2 inches in 6 hours, has no flooding if sea level rise is not selected. Just confirming, we're saying the stormwater system will currently handle that with no sea level rise.
Oh, and we can turn off, no storm surge.
Yep.
Is that the question?
You know what? I was gonna have John Walkie chalk and clarify, but
Okay.
he's not on anymore, so I'm just gonna move on from that one.
Okay.
We have a lot of questions like that. There's one bigger philosophical question from Julie Wormser, who says, how much flooding is too much or too often before we need managed retreat? Have you started to invest in moving your infrastructure uphill or inland?
Luckily, that question is way above my pay grade. But there's an interesting analysis of that, and I want to show that because I think it's an interesting question. Let's go with, I think what's important here to understand and look at. If you look at Boston, it's not the entire city that's impacted, it's sections of the city. And we need to look at those sections to see what we can do. Now, we're not going to solve everything, but by what I was talking about with different areas, we could make significant impacts on sections of the city. We need to identify that first before we start going to that. We've been talking about, some other people and I have been talking about this managed retreat. Boston has a thing on its side, it's both for and against it, is the topography. A lot of the city's high. We go down to the ocean. It's those areas that we have to be concerned with. Now, John's right. It's also these little valleys with the Archdale and stuff like that. But I think we need to kind of consider it's not the entire city, it's sections of it. I think this is where Climate Ready Boston comes in important, is what are we going to do about those sections? And it's one of my things is, let's bite this off and address what we have and see what we can do. But, and I get Julie's question. It's a good question.
Great. I'm looking at the time. I want to note that we have one more pro tip from John Sullivan, who tells us that 2 inches of rain over 24 hours is not a big deal, but 2 inches of rain over 3 hours may cause flooding. It's all about the intensity.
Yes.
Before I let Bud wrap up, I want to make sure we've clarified 3 important things. One is this amazing inundation model that you're playing with right now is not available to the public yet, but it will be soon.
Yes.
Correct? And we can let people know when that's out and available. Yep. We are recording this presentation today, so if you missed part of it or you want to watch it again, you can. We'll be able to share this video with you. And if you would like the slides, you can check in with me. I can send you a copy of the slides that Charlie has already sent to me. And if people have further questions, they can always reach out to Charlie.
Yes.
So with that, Bud, I'm going to let you wrap things up.
Great. Thank you, Alice. And I want to really thank Charlie and others at Boston Water and Sewer Commission again for this wonderful presentation today. You know, I think between all the work you all are doing in that agency, all the work that's been done for Climate Ready Boston and other agencies and the private sector in the city, we have a pretty good handle on who, what, and where is going to be vulnerable when in our good city, which is the really important starting point that, you know, has to underpin the whole solution strategy. So it's really great to see all that good work. Thank you again. Alice, I'm nominating you to moderate the next presidential debate next week or whenever that is. Much better than last night. And then just to wrap up, thank you everybody for participating. I think we hit 140 or 150 people at some point, something like that, which is great. If you're not already on the Boston Harbor Now email list, you can go to the website bostonharbornow.org and get on that list. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I hope to see you all on the next Harbor Use Forum, which will be on October 28th. We haven't quite confirmed it yet, but we're hoping it will be focused on one of the developments in the 4 Point Channel area, which would be a nice follow-on to this conversation today. So thanks, everybody, again. Keep dry today. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.